Who am I, Mommy?
He's got it!
Hitchcock always used sound in an interesting way.
The sound that he uses to accompany a montage. That's where Hitchcock absolutely leaves everyone else in the dust.
The idea is that a movie is a kind of total experience.
Hitchcock was always interested in expanding the envelope of using sound in movies.
He exploded the idea that sound just reinforced what you were seeing. He used the soundtrack as a whole other conduit.
No, I don't want to, Mama, no.
Hitchcock was very specific on a sense of style. And it wasn't like the Hitchcockian style for everything he did. His sense of style was experimentation, and he was very good at responding to new technologies. We're talking about sound, that's a new technology he responded to and embraced as part of his storytelling.
Look at this. It's been in use. Let's go around the window.
Hitchcock used sound, or didn't use sound, very, very effectively to create a mood or a sense of dread without creating a wall of sound or a wash of sound.
There's a moment in Herman's main title where the cymbals crash, and Hitchcock wrote in his sound notes that the sound of the cymbals crashing were to segue into the sound of the tires on the road in Jimmy Stewart, Doris Day's bus in Marrakesh. And if you listen to it, it's there. It's so uncanny. That's how meticulous Hitchcock was about sound.
One thing that made Hitchcock so successful, he's one of the few people that was around that bridged the period from silent filmmaking to full-blown stereophonic sound filmmaking, and he evolved and incorporated those elements as his career progressed.
There's a scene in The Birds when the mother of the Rod Taylor character discovers that one of her neighbors has been killed by these birds. When she leaves the scene of the killing, she gets into a truck. And here's what Hitchcock said about the sound of that truck. The screech of the truck engine starting off conveys her anguish. It's as though the truck were shrieking. That's, in a nutshell, what sound design for movies is.
Amazingly, Hitchcock experimented with sound from the very beginning. The first sound film he made, I believe, was Blackmail, and he would show visually things different than what you would hear. So if there was two people talking, he would show a close-up of something else or some other part of the room so that the soundtrack and the visuals didn't always correlate.
Very often the sound was in complete contrast to the imagery. The sound of the shower scene isn't the literal sound of each one of those knife cuts. You hear her screaming, but mostly what you hear is high, shrieking musical chords.
The Birds is full of great examples. When the birds are collecting on the jungle gym before the big attack of the kids, it's this really ominous visual of this gathering storm, this gathering threat to these black birds. Other directors would have had ominous music or ominous sound effects even, but no, Hitchcock has singing children. So that you have this contrast between the innocence of the victims that are going to be and the visual of the threat that's gathering on screen. So he's telling you two different parts of the story, and it's much more effective.
There are lots of advantages to using different kinds of subjectivity in a film sequence. When you're not locked into people's literal expectations about what you would see and hear in a given situation, and instead you set it up so that it's clear to the audience that what they're seeing and hearing is being filtered through the consciousness of a character, then it not only allows you to say a lot about each element of that environment, but that subjective style also allows you to say a lot about what's going on in the mind and the heart of the person whose point of view it is. Rear Window is really all about point of view. You have this Jimmy Stewart character who's sitting in his apartment with a broken leg, unable to move, and all he has to do every day is to look at and listen to his neighbors.
The salesman's looking out of his window, you see? Get back. He'll see you.
I'm not shy. I've been looked at before.
Hitchcock was able to stylize the sound very specifically so that as the camera pans with Jimmy Stewart's eyes from the guy playing the piano in one window across the courtyard to a couple fighting in the next window, that's the main thing we're hearing. You get a lot of power, storytelling power, when you're able to stylize a sequence like that.
Hitchcock came out of an expressionistic tradition somewhat too, sort of the German tradition as well as the English and American tradition. So he was always trying to get inside someone's head. So there's a famous example in Lady Vanishes where the Margaret Lockwood character is passing out on a train. And there were some great visual effects, but really the stunning thing or the sound of the train just gets really loud and intense. It is psychologically effective.
A good example of subjective sound is when Raymond Burr in Rear Window, the villain, comes clumping up those stairs at the very end, and Jimmy Stewart hears that as this terrifying crescendo of clumps, and it would not be that loud in real life, but in his head it's that loud.
The end of Rope, you know the cops are coming for the bad guys. You don't see them at all, but you hear them coming. And even that early on, Hitchcock, I know, paid a lot of attention to recording dialogue, people speaking, actors speaking, sirens, not in a controlled circumstance, but in the real world with, distance and the sound of it slapping off of buildings so that it sounded realistic. In Rear Window, the voices across the courtyard and the music were all recorded at quite a distance, even at a time when signal-to-noise ratio was an issue, so he didn't care. He wanted that quality that we know from life.
In terms of sound effects, I think he uses them sparingly, and it's very innovative, I think, where he would drop the sound out completely and maybe just punctuate it with a sound effect at the end.
Got a place to stay?
Oh, hello, it's you, Bob.
Yeah.
There's times where Hitchcock would use sounds he didn't need to use in a film, like in The Birds. As they start to attack, the sounds of the birds are birds, but they're also very cat-like. Bird vocals aren't known for having typically that attack sound, but listen to how they just kind of like leap out.
Help me get the children into the house.
And as the scene develops, again, maybe it's manipulated actual bird sounds, or maybe they added the sound of rattlesnake rattling, because it definitely has that sound to it as well. And I don't think there's too many people that hear the sound of a rattlesnake and not go running, which is the whole intent of the scene.
I found in the files in Hollywood these incredibly meticulous, detailed 9 pages of notes by Hitchcock himself, which outlined every single sound in the birds. And the reason he was able to do that was that he had access to something called the Troutonium, which was this very cool device used by the New York City Ballet. So Hitchcock could actually describe every sound he wanted and have it enacted, and it was very precise. If you read those sound notes by Hitchcock and then listen to the birds as well as watch it, every single thing he describes, from high-pitched screams to the low brooding murmur at the end, as he put it, is really there. It's very striking.
Hitchcock also found ways to help create tension through some subliminal sound. In Saboteur, as the factory workers are leaving the factory of the midnight shift, Hitchcock used the sound of crickets, which obviously you would because it's at night. But he's taken those crickets and he has increased their volume throughout the course of the scene. And in doing so, it starts to create a tension that as an audience you're not going to specifically pay attention to, but you're going to feel. And it lets you know that something's amiss.
I wonder what his name is. Wait a minute, I saw it on the envelope. Fry. That's it, Fry.
As an old sound effects guy, what I liked is Hitchcock treated the entire soundtrack like sound effects, meaning he was interested in the effect. Everything in the soundtrack had meaning dialogue, too. He wasn't afraid to show dialogue absolutely no respect and clobber it.
In Topaz, Roscoe Lee Brown is across the street from Michael Piccoli, and he's having a dialogue with this Cuban agent, and we, the audience, don't hear any of the dialogue. We are in the place of Michael Piccoli watching. We don't need the sound there.
Hitchcock experimented with using sound in many interesting ways, and then he got to his peak, I think, in using sound interestingly in Rear Window. The sounds of the courtyard Hitchcock uses to set location and reality. We hear kids playing and people talking and trains go by and cars and all that kind of stuff, which is great. But he's also always deliberately choosing what to put on this realistic soundtrack for emotional reasons. And this is the big Grace Kelly introduction. Listen to what the soundtrack does. One of the things it does, it goes away. And Hitchcock was audacious enough at a time when few people were to just pull the track out altogether. So this is focusing, audio focus, which you focus just like you do visuals. Audio goes away, so you focus on Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly.
How's your leg?
Hurts a little.
Interestingly, the music becomes important through this whole thing. Here, it's unfinished. It's just practicing scales. It's not a finished song. In the love story, Jimmy Stewart's character is unsure that he loves Grace Kelly. So when we introduce her, instead of playing romantic music, which we've heard in the courtyard elsewhere in this movie, when Grace Kelly shows up, no, we play scales. There's no finished melody at all. This is a scene where the Thorwalds are introduced. And listen to what sound effects he chooses. So he's looking at the Thorwalds, a married couple having some tension, and in his mind he's thinking, I don't want to do that. This is not the life for me. So what's in the soundtrack? No music, no pretty romantic music, but sirens and boat horns and fog horns and nasty, awful stuff. It's telling us what Jimmy Stewart is thinking. Now we transition to not only Alfred Hitchcock's cameo, but the romantic song that becomes the key song for the love story.
Oh, it's enchanting. It's almost as if it were being written especially for us.
Aha! It is. So now we come to the end of the movie, and visually this is a scene about Grace Kelly Jimmy Stewart has wondered, is she the girl for me? Is she, she's a Park Avenue girl. Is she tough enough for me? She breaks into Raymond Burr's apartment, the bad guy's apartment, when he's not there to get a clue.
All right, fellas, let's try it once from the beginning.
From here on, it's just that song, which is called Lisa.
Give me the police. 6th precinct.
This is the fullest expression of the song we've heard in the movie so far, the most complete version of the song that represents their love story. But what's happening is that Hitchcock is showing us the part of the movie that's a murder mystery. This is really suspenseful and painful to watch. The soundtrack is climaxing the love story, because the song is telling us that Jimmy Stewart is now finally in love with Grace Kelly. But the disconnect is rich. If you have the soundtrack telling you one part of the story and the visual telling you another, there's this richness that comes out of it, as well as a tension, because the mood of the music is not the mood of what we're seeing.
The scariest suspense moments are not animated by conventional suspense cues, but by boogie woogies, or the theme song, which is called Lisa, or Mona Lisa, or any number of songs wafting out those windows. It's everything but conventional, scary suspense music. It's just the opposite, and it makes the movie more suspenseful.
Please. Stella, what do we do?
Hitchcock was a great believer in music in films. He felt that music is one of the best ways to make the picture even more powerful in its effects on the audience. But always he was interested in challenges, and always he was interested in testing his talents and seeing what new approaches he could take. And this reached a kind of a climax with The Birds, where he decided eventually not to have a music score at all.
When we talk about Hitchcock's insistence on no music for The Birds, we have to keep something in mind. From his very earliest days, Hitchcock was involved in the music for his films. His notes given to the composer were remarkably detailed. He knew what he wanted in terms of sound. Again and again, actors and actresses told me, for example, that if fingers were tapping on a table, he knew how loud the volume should be, and that's noted in the script. He knew when he wanted realistic sounds up and down. For example, in Vertigo, you expect at some point to hear a cable car, maybe a ship's whistle or a foghorn. When those sounds should be in, when they should come up, when they should decrease, and when they should be out. So when he came to The Birds, it wasn't some fresh, new approach for him. It was, what do the visuals demand? What does the suspense demand?
Hitchcock was trying to break out of a mold when he did something like The Birds. He was looking for the equivalent of that radical idea of the birds attacking us, and that became electronic music, or it's called actually musique concrète. It's a French phrase meaning music of the real.
And it starts right from the opening credits. I mean, almost never in the movies are there opening credits without some kind of music.
What begins as a very kind of atmospheric, reverberant kinds of seagull sounds that, if anything, are kind of calm and reassuring and like an afternoon at the seaside, turns finally into an attack of all kinds of birds, and not only naturalistic sounding birds, but almost like birds from another planet. If you listen to it with a bird watcher's ear, you hear that there are some real birds in there, but there are also these birds that were invented by Oscar Sala. They are electronically generated. They are way, way more kind of energetic and dramatic sounding than anything you'd likely be able to get by actually using recordings of birds.
The extraordinary thing about The Birds is that I think it's precisely the suspense that increases because there is no music.
The crows again.
Shh. We don't expect a Technicolor motion picture not to have a love theme, suspense music. We rely on music. But Hitchcock said no. And he was right to say no. If we can imagine the Birds with a comic score for the first half hour, and then a melodramatic score, and then a suspenseful score when she goes up the steps at the end, it would be a completely different picture. The silence gives us a kind of nightmarish eeriness. And the only sound is this creepy fluttering of wings and cawing of birds.
No. No.
In the Birds, there's a feeling of reality. You're really there. That sometimes score takes you out of the reality. It's a little more melodramatic or stylized. Maybe the conceit of the birds attacking humanity is so out there that the more realistic the soundtrack was, maybe that's why it's more horrifying. Psycho, which is the opposite, then it's really dependent on Bernard Herrmann's score. The effect of Psycho on us, even as a horror film, I think is very different than The Birds. The Birds is kind of stark and bleak and realistic, and Psycho is bigger than life and really stylized.
Hitchcock had in his mind this story and exactly the way it would look and exactly the way it would sound. I think that his idea of pure cinema came out of that. We often say, I don't like movies that manipulate me. Well, I love being manipulated by Hitchcock because he's such a master of it.
Mrs. Bates.
His films are just, they're so grand. I mean, he's trying so many big things, and you can see it. You can actually see what he's doing. It's so effective that it makes you want to try something too. It's inspiring. I think the key to Hitchcock is that he seemed to have a lot of fun making movies and just squeezing out of the movie-making process everything you could get out of it.